I inform the House of the death on 3 August 2021 of Julian Howard Beale, a member of this House for the division of Deakin from 1984 until 1990, and Bruce from 1990 to 1996. As a mark of respect to the memory of Julian Beale, I invite all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
A brief indulgence on behalf of this side of the House. I dissociate this side of the House with the comments of the member for Dawson during 90-second statements. They're a disgrace and do discredit to the 4 people who lost their lives in the last 24 hours.
Leader of the Opposition will come to his question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Before the horror 2019-20 bushfires, the Prime Minister ignored warnings from former fire chiefs that Australia was unprepared for the dangers. Now the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned, quote, the intensity, frequency and duration of fire weather events are projected to increase throughout Australia. Will the Prime Minister ignore this warning too?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, Australia has not ignored any of those warnings. Right. Mr Speaker, our government,
members on my left,
Mr Speaker, has been acting on those warnings, Mr Speaker, each and every day. That is why, Mr Speaker, emissions reductions have been 20%, Mr Speaker, on 2005 levels. It is why, Mr Speaker, that we've installed 7 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity in 2020. This is around 8 times faster than New Zealand, Japan, Italy and the global average per person, Mr Speaker. It's 3 times faster than Germany and the EU, Mr Speaker. It is why we have the highest rate of solar uptake on roofs in the world, Mr Speaker. It is why that we have met and beaten our Kyoto target, and we will meet and beat, Mr Speaker, our Paris target. It is why that we remained a steadfast, committed government to the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. It is why we have invested $20 billion in ensuring the technology that not just Australia needs, Mr Speaker, but developing countries, not just in our region, like Indonesia and Vietnam, and Papua New Guinea, Mr Speaker, and other countries seeking to ensure that they can develop their economies, but do so in a way that deals with a world net zero economy of the future. Mr Speaker, we know that every household, farms, businesses, small and large, Mr Speaker, are making the changes, whether it be in the mining industry, whether it be in the agricultural sector, in manufacturing, Mr Speaker, wherever it will be, they are being supported in the decisions that they are taking because of the very serious issues that have been once again confirmed by the IPCC report. So, Mr Speaker, we will continue to take action. We must continue to take action. And performance matters and performance counts. Australia is the only country, to the best of our knowledge, Mr Speaker, who reports quarterly on our emissions reductions. Every sector, every gas, every quarter. I wish other countries did the same, Mr Speaker, but that's what Australia does, because Australia knows that the way we achieve this is by equipping our industries, equipping our farmers, equipping Australians who are passionately committed to addressing this urgent action, Mr Speaker, and urgent action that our government is supporting them to take through the policies that we've put in place, Mr Speaker. We set out our plans. We are very careful to explain to Australians, Mr Speaker, what the costs are involved and how we will manage those risks. There won't be handing over of blank cheques, Mr Speaker, on this issue from our government. We will ensure that we can work with Australians, whether they be in regional areas, the suburbs of our great cities, or wherever they happen to be, Mr Speaker, that we will carry this burden together, but we'll ensure that that burden does not fall on some Australians like in regional Australia, Mr Speaker, and they are carrying the burden for the rest of us. We will ensure that our plan addresses their needs, Mr Speaker, and takes all of Australia with us in addressing this very serious global challenge.
The member for Isaacs will withdraw that.
I withdraw.
And I call the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on progress of the Morrison government's plan to chart Australia's path back from the COVID-19 pandemic and how this plan will ensure that we can live with the virus and emerge stronger on the other side?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Curtin for her question. Mr Speaker, the news in New South Wales today, for all of us who are from New South Wales, but not just New South Wales, I'm sure the member for Curtin as well, it's heavy news. 356 cases to date. Mr Speaker, there are 297 in hospital. There are 60 in ICU in New South Wales, including 28 on ventilators. There have been 30 deaths this year in New South Wales, and that includes 3 in the past 24 hours. Mr Speaker, the national plan that we have championed sets our pathway out of this, and every Australian has a role to play in every single phase of that plan. And right now, Mr Speaker, we are in that suppression phase that seeks to minimise as best as we possibly can in this Delta virus, this Delta strain, which has completely changed the response, Mr Speaker, that is needed to address COVID. Delta has changed everything, Mr Speaker. Australians understand that. So, Mr Speaker, we are acting to support, whether it's in New South Wales or elsewhere, in this suppression phase, bringing forward the doses, hundreds of thousands, whether they be in New South Wales, Queensland or Victoria, Mr Speaker. Moderna has now, of course, had the TGA approval, and that was announced by the Health Minister and Professor Skerritt, Mr Speaker, and those first doses have come in September. The mental health supports, Mr Speaker, that we are providing, not just in New South Wales but also in Victoria, over $17 million of urgent mental health support in New South Wales, done with the New South Wales government, over $12.5 million directly from the federal government, similar to what we did in Victoria during their long lockdown last year. Mr Speaker, COVID Assist has 581 ADF deployed in New South Wales right now, and the economic supports continue to flow through the COVID Disaster Assistance Payment, and I commend those at Services Australia, and also those working in Services New South Wales who are delivering the business payments which we are sharing the cost of. So, Mr Speaker, for those who are affected by those lockdowns, particularly in New South Wales, the challenge is to stay at home and to get vaccinated. 234,899 doses yesterday. 7 days, 1.36 million doses in 7 days. That is the mark of a program, Mr Speaker, that has been turned around. The mark of the program that has had its challenges for all the reasons we have gone on to, but, Mr Speaker, that the government has addressed and has turned around and is ensuring that those dosage rates, Mr Speaker, are hitting the levels that are necessary to get this job done. 14 million doses we are now closing in on, Mr Speaker, this week. 45% of the population had their first dose. Mr Speaker, we need to enter Phase B strong, and we need to not, Mr Speaker, squander the great gains that have made by Australians as we go into Phase B, Mr Speaker. We must not give up in the fight against Delta. This government will never do that, and we will continue to support Australians as we take them through and out of this crisis.
I now call the member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In response to last night's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the Prime Minister claimed today we need more technology and no one will be matching our ambition for a technology-driven solution. If that's true, why did the Prime Minister claim that electric vehicles would end the weekend?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I'll ask the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction to add to my answer, but the claim made by the questioner, Mr Speaker, is false, and I will ask the Minister to respond.
Members on my left. I'm just going to say, before I call the Manager of Opposition Business, I find it very difficult to see how this could be a point of order on relevance. If the Manager of Opposition Business and clearly members behind him are taking issue with what the Prime Minister said, there's no standing order that covers that. But I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, I was wanting to be helpful to give the Prime Minister the quote where he said it would end the weekend.
Oh, OK. Well, you can seek to table something later on if you wish to, but the Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, and I thank the member for McMahon for his question. Of course, the report that we saw come out last night underscores the importance of our work in Australia to reduce emissions in Australia and to support reduction of emissions right around the world, Mr Speaker. And this will be achieved through practical solutions that allow Australia and other countries throughout the world to reduce their emissions whilst maintaining strong economies, investment, growth, Mr Speaker, and the secret to that is technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker, because technology allows us to break the trade-off between economy and environment. We can have both healthy environment and healthy economy through the deployment, development, investment in technology. Now, Mr Speaker, our approach is working. Our approach is working. We've seen that we beat our Kyoto targets, our 2020 targets, by 459 million tonnes, almost a year's worth of emissions. Central to that is the hard work of our farmers, Mr Speaker. Central to that is 1 in 4 Australians with solar on the roofs. Central to that, Mr Speaker, is manufacturing energy efficiencies and changes in the way we're manufacturing products in this country to bring down our energy costs and bring down emissions at the same time, Mr Speaker. And we are on track to meet and beat our 2030 targets, Mr Speaker. Indeed, in the last 2 years alone, we've improved our performance versus our 2030 targets by the equivalent of taking every car in Australia off the road for 15 years. That's 14.5 million cars, Mr Speaker. We didn't have to take cars off the road to do that, Mr Speaker. We didn't have to take cars off the road to do that. Indeed, our investments, Mr Speaker, across low-energy technologies, commitments come to $20 billion over the coming decade. That will be matched with private sector investment to total up $80 billion of investment. Mr Speaker, included in that is $1.4 billion to help increase the uptake of low and zero emissions vehicle technologies as part of our future fuels strategy, Mr Speaker. And we believe in choice. Central to this is the decisions made by Australians to choose technologies that are the right technologies for them, Mr Speaker. We're getting on the job with the job. It's technology, not taxes.
The Manager of Opposition Business seeking to table the document.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I seek to table the transcript of the Prime Minister's press conference on the 10th of August.
Leave granted.
On the 7th of April 2019, where he referred to ending the weekend. Granted? The words that he doesn't think he said.
Is leave granted?
Is not granted.
Leave is not granted. The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Morrison government's strong economic leadership ensuring our economy remains resilient during these challenging times so that Australia is well placed to bounce back again in the future? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question, acknowledge his experience with small business. He's not just a good guy, but he's actually owned a Good Guys franchise, Mr Speaker, like many on this side of the House with the small business background. Now, Mr Speaker, these are trying times for the Australian economy, indeed for the Australian community, with people across Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales in lockdown. Now, this is having an impact on economic activity. This is having an impact on business and consumer confidence, and this is having an impact on the number of hours worked. That is why we're responding with extensive economic support. Since July, around $2 billion has been paid out through the COVID disaster payment to around 1 million people. And we've seen business support go to Victoria, where we've combined for an $800 million, 2 packages to provide support to small businesses. We saw earlier this week support with the Marshall government for South Australian businesses, with cash grants of around $3,000 for small businesses. And we've also partnered in New South Wales in a 50-50 split to ensure that businesses receive economic support. Now, we know that the Australian economy has underlying strength, and we know that it will bounce back from these challenges that it faces today. That's because it's done it before. But even to look at the current challenges in context, we know that consumer confidence today is around 50% higher than it was in March last year. We know that consumer spending today from bank data is around 30% higher than it was in April last year. And we also know that around 200,000 people have come off unemployment benefits since the end of JobKeeper. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite always seek to talk down the Australian economy. Mr Speaker, those opposite are taking to the Australian people higher taxes, Mr Speaker. Those opposite are seeking to splash billions of dollars on people who have already had the jab, Mr Speaker. And those opposite are seeking to diminish the success of nation-saving programs like JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. Nation-saving programs like JobKeeper. Now, today there was a revelation. Today there was breaking news that it's been revealed that $22 million in JobKeeper payments went to Labor-associated services, Mr Speaker. Labor-associated services, i.e. trade unions. So I say to those opposite, when it comes to paying back JobKeeper, stop harassing the churches, stop harassing small business and start closer to home with trade unions.
The member for Isaacs. Members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition, the Manager of Opposition Business. Leader of the Opposition, the Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Morrison government advise Anne from Punchbowl, who was in lockdown, that she would lose her pension if she didn't provide specific proof of age documents, which she does not have, especially given Anne is 102, bedbound, has been a pensioner for 40 years and, were it not for the intervention of my office, would have had to travel in an ambulance to Services New South Wales to keep her pension?
Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker, and thanks for the opportunity to respond to the question. Clearly I'm not across the constituents' details, and nor would she understand why she
Minister will just pause for a second. The question's been asked. I'm trying to listen to the answer. Members giving a commentary will be ejected. The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'm not across the constituents' details, but absolutely send it to my office or Minister Reynolds' office and we'll have a look at it for you. I'm not too sure why she would have been sent to Services New South Wales. This should be updating a pension documentation. It would be done online or with Services Australia. But send the details through and we're more than happy to have a look at it. Everyone's circumstances are completely different and unique, and without looking at the facts of the case, it's difficult to give a concise answer. Send the details through. More than happy to come back to yourself or the House.
The member for INDI has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today you said regional communities should not be forced to carry the national burden when it comes to climate change. Regional communities are already carrying this burden: drought, bushfires, floods and future trade costs. Our communities are suffering on top of this with delayed vaccines, lockdowns, economic hardship. But the regions are smart and ready to seize new opportunities, opportunities like community-owned renewable energy. You're standing in the way. Why won't you show the leadership that we need and commit to net zero emissions by 2050?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, we should achieve net zero as soon as possible, Mr Speaker, and preferably by 2050. That's what the government's policy has been. But I can tell you this. I agree with the member. I agree with the member that the impacts of climate change are impacted most greatly across our regions and the agricultural sectors, as we've seen right across the country for many years, Mr Speaker. But that does not mean that they should shoulder the economic burden of that, Mr Speaker, greater than other parts of the country. And I'm sure the member would agree with me when it comes to those issues. And I agree with the member that people in regional communities have shown the innovation, particularly our agricultural sector, Mr Speaker, but also our mineral sector. In our mining sector, Mr Speaker, our global mining companies are leading the way when it comes to transferring their operations to net zero practices. Our farmers are doing it, our miners are doing it, our households are doing it, Mr Speaker, and they're all being enabled by the policies of the government to support them to do that, Mr Speaker, because the way we address this is by ensuring the changes take place at that level, right across the country. and that no part of the country, Mr Speaker, should have to carry a greater burden. And our policies are designed to support, whether it's regions or other parts of our economy, to make the transformations that they're making, because they can see that that is not only in the country's national environmental interests, Mr Speaker, and the planet's environmental interests, but it's also in their commercial interests, and it's important for the future of their communities and their businesses and their farms and their jobs, Mr Speaker. Now, the member would, I'm sure, agree that there are great anxieties about this issue in regional communities, and we need to address those anxieties and assure people in regional parts of the country that the plan we have to achieve these outcomes, Mr Speaker, is a plan that they can support and a plan that they can bet behind, that there are no blank cheques that they're being asked to sign off on, Mr Speaker, that they're not being asked to live up to a commitment, Mr Speaker, where there's no plan. And it's very important that we're straight with the Australian people about how we achieve these things, and that they understand what is needed and how we achieve the technological advances that are necessary to make this a reality, not just here, Mr Speaker, but all around the world, and particularly in developing countries. That's what we're seeking to do. I welcome the very practical initiatives that the member has been putting forward and raising with the government on microgrids, and indeed microgrids, Mr Speaker, are a policy of this government, as the member for Leichhardt is very aware. These are the practical solutions that take us through and allow regional communities to transition and transform, and, Mr Speaker, not be left behind as a result of an unfunded, unplanned commitment that others would seek to make at the great cost to other Australians.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how new vaccine approvals and the delivery of over 1.3 million vaccinations in the last week and over 200,000 vaccinations in the last 24 hours are helping to protect Australian lives and livelihoods?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins. I want to thank the member for Higgins for her support for the vaccination program, and indeed we travelled to the Prahran Town Hall to see a Commonwealth vaccination clinic in operation, and they will have contributed in the last 24 hours to the almost 240,000 vaccines that were administered, 34,000 up on this time last week, the highest first day of the week that we've had. It represents in one day the population of Ballarat and Bendigo combined. In the last week, what we've seen, an increase since we talked yesterday, 1.363 million, as the Prime Minister said. Now, approximately the population of Adelaide, subject to the census tonight, of course. But the fact that in 1 week we've been able to have the population of Adelaide vaccinated, in 1 day the population of Ballarat and Bendigo combined, indicates that Australians are coming forward to be vaccinated, are coming forward, and that they are taking their responsibility on themselves, to protect others, and that partnership with the Australian people is strong and delivering vaccination for Australians. Indeed, we're at almost 14 million vaccinations right across the nation at this point in time, and that includes over 9 million first vaccinations and now 4.75 million second vaccinations. And so these things are saving lives and protecting lives. They're combining with all the other things that Australians have done to protect through borders, testing, tracing, distancing and vaccination against the spread of COVID-19. We've seen again over 600,000 cases worldwide, again over 8,000 lives lost. It is a global pandemic, the likes of which we have not seen for 100 years. So against that background, I'm pleased that only yesterday the Therapeutic Goods Administration has approved another vaccine for Australia, the Moderna vaccine. There are 10 million doses that are expected over the balance of this year and 15 million doses as potential boosters in next year of the Moderna vaccine. And that will complement the AstraZeneca vaccine. It will complement the Pfizer vaccine. All of these things come together to ensure that each Australian, every Australian, has the opportunity to be vaccinated this year. And when we do that, each person's making a statement and an action to support their own health, but they're making a contribution to the rest of the nation. And we thank them for that and we honour them for that, but we urge all Australians to come forward, to be vaccinated, to protect their lives and to protect the lives of all Australians.
The member for Maribyrnong.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. I refer to reports that his government is trying to claw back $32 million from low-income individuals, including aged pensioners, who receive JobKeeper payments. Why is the Morrison government harassing and targeting ordinary Australians but refusing to demand a refund from big corporations who banked $13 billion in JobKeeper payments whilst their earnings and profits grew last year?
The Minister representing the Minister for Services Australia.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for his question? As everyone knows in the House, governments have a responsibility of all persuasions to ensure that debts are recovered fairly, lawfully, transparently and respectfully. For example, as at August, $296.6 million in overpayments has been recovered by the ATO, of which $185 million in cash has been recovered. The ATO is fulfilling its responsibilities, in this case almost $1/3 billion in recovering. The same issue and the same standard applies to Australians. When JobSeeker and JobKeeper were put into the Australian population, it was quite clear that Australians knew that you could not claim both. Indeed, the customer journey for every Australian when they went online or by using the telephony service had to actually read through and acknowledge in the same format and standard as if you were acknowledging a statutory declaration, because that is the requirement of the law that all Services Australia government services or human services ministers have worked under for decades. And they had to actually state that they were not taking JobSeeker and JobKeeper. The government has a responsibility, as all governments have had to over the decades, to do targeted compliance as required by the Australian National Audit Office. And that compliance showed that a number of Australians had unfortunately claimed both of them. The law requires the government to then respectfully go back to the Australian to point out to them that they've claimed both JobSeeker and JobKeeper. Now, the Leader of the Opposition says to me this is about the fair go. With great respect, sir, it's actually about following the law. And the law requires that overpayments are not allowed. And the laws being administered by the ATO, $296 million worth of overpayments being recovered, the law also requires that you can't receive both JobKeeper and JobSeeker. And every Australian that applied for it acknowledged that they couldn't receive both of those payments. Services Australia is now going forward transparently, respectfully to say you've claimed both and is seeking to recover the debts lawfully as required that all governments have been required to do for decades and decades and decades, because that's the standard of a highly targeted welfare system that we all as Australians enjoy and that many members of the Leader of the Opposition's front bench have administered over the years.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture in Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison-Joyce government is working to improve the quality of Australian soils and ensure Australian farmers are rewarded for their stewardship of land and water?
The Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Flynn for his question and his interest in our soil management and our landscape management, our stewardship, and how that's underpinning agricultural production here in Australia. Our $66 billion industry, hoping to take that to $100 billion by 2030. And as part of the Ag 2030 plan, one of the key pillars is stewardship of the land. And we're making investments in that, real tactile investments, through our National Soil Strategy that's been run by the Honourable Penelope Wensley, AC, and our Biodiversity Stewardship Program, with real money. And in the budget, we made sure that we made significant investments in that. In the Soil Strategy, nearly $215 million in real projects, $120 million of that in rewarding farmers, incentivising farmers to undertake soils tests, to be able to understand their soil health, to understand what needs to go into it to improve their productivity, but also to look after it, and then sharing that data so that other farmers can learn. But there's also $67 million in a practical solution about matching households and their organic waste to turn it into compost, to go into soils, working with local governments so that households can be part of the solution of improving our soils, improving our productivity and profitability for our farms. There's $20 million for education of our farmers in making sure that that data is shared. But underpinning that is our $40 million through our soil CRC, and that collates and collects the data and makes sure that we're able to target government measures in a practical way. And that'll also feed in to the aim and ambition of this government to try and create a test for soil carbon under $3 a hectare. That will change the landscape, that will change the management of our farmers. Have real measures towards not just carbon abatement, but improving our productivity right across the country. And this complements the Biodiversity Stewardship Program. We are the first country in the world to be able to measure the improvement in biodiversity. No other country in the world has been able to crack the code bar us. We should be so proud of the best and brightest minds in the world that have done this. And so what we will do with this is make sure that we reward farmers, not for locking up large tracts of land, but for rejuvenating unproductive land, landscape that is damaged, and being rewarded for it financially, not just for carbon abatement, but for biodiversity improvement. And then what we intend to do with that is actually create a seal, a brand that those farmers can place on their beef, on their sheep, on their wheat and their pork, and they can send it around the world for a premium. The world wants to know the provenance of their food and fibre, and that Australian farmers are the best at it, and we want them to be rewarded for it. This is the Australian way of solving problems, not senseless vandalism.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tragically, COVID infections in New South Wales reached a new daily record today. The New South Wales Premier said today, vaccination reduces your chance of spreading, reduces your chance of landing in hospital, and it reduces your chance of dying. New South Wales Premier has also said it is a race. Will the Prime Minister admit that if he had not bungled the vaccine rollout, New South Wales would not be in the position it is today?
Hear, hear.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I don't agree with the assertion put forward by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the federal government has ensured that New South Wales has been supported to the tune of 386,000 additional doses of Pfizer, Mr Speaker. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, over 1 million doses of AstraZeneca have been available. And I'm pleased at the strong response, Mr Speaker, of the New South Wales government and the people of Sydney as they've been coming forward, and the vaccination rates in Sydney have been lifting, particularly over the last few weeks, Mr Speaker, during the course of the lockdown, and in particular, Mr Speaker, in those 9 local government areas that have been at the centre of the outbreak in New South Wales. We will continue to support the New South Wales government, both in supporting the effectiveness of the lockdown that is critical to suppressing this virus, the Delta strain, Mr Speaker, which has completely changed everything when it comes to the COVID response, and the plans and the initiatives that are necessary in this phase of our 4-phase plan. It is absolutely vital that we seek to suppress the virus as much as we possibly can in this phase, so we can enter the next phase in the strong position that Australians have worked very hard to achieve. We do know that in other countries that have higher vaccination rates than Australia, Mr Speaker, whether in Singapore, within the United Kingdom, within Denmark, in the Netherlands, Mr Speaker, or other countries around the world, including China, Mr Speaker, where they have had to go back into lockdowns, Mr Speaker, as a result of the Delta strain. Now, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, in raising that question today and putting it in that way, Mr Speaker, may wish to pretend that the Delta variant, Mr Speaker, is a myth, or he may wish to pretend that it doesn't change the responses that are necessary, Mr Speaker. He may seek to undermine the efforts of the government as we seek to support the New South Wales government in dealing with this outbreak, Mr Speaker. He's got one job, and that's to undermine the government, Mr Speaker, not support us in this effort. Mr Speaker, we will continue to support the New South Wales Government and the people of New South Wales, whether it's in mental health support, the Australian Defence Force on the ground, additional vaccines and targeting those vaccines, particularly into those areas most affected, ensuring those regional communities who had vaccines taken away from them, 20,000 vaccines back into the Central Coast, back into the Hunter, back into Armidale, back into Tamworth, which are also in lockdown now. We will continue to support the people of New South Wales, Mr Speaker, as they go through one of the toughest challenges of this COVID-19 pandemic. Mr Speaker, this year I'm advised by the Minister for Health that the number of cases in 2021 are already almost 50% higher than the total number of cases in 2020. That is the difference in 2021, that the Delta variant of this virus is impacting on nations all around the world. The whole world is in a battle against the Delta strain of this virus. And in this country, Mr Speaker, our country continues to perform.
The time has concluded. And I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister please update the House on the importance of a technology-led approach to reducing emissions? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question and for her strong commitment to low emissions technologies and the role they can play in industry in northern Tasmania, and in particular to her commitment to the potential of hydrogen at Bell Bay in her electorate, Mr Speaker. She knows that there are only two ways to reduce emissions: technology or taxes, and this government picks technology, Mr Speaker. Now, the Morrison government's technology investment roadmap is positioning Australia to be a leader in the next generation clean energy, low emissions technologies that will make net zero practically achievable, Mr Speaker. And the roadmap will drive $80 billion of combined public and private sector investment, indeed 160,000 jobs over the next decade, Mr Speaker. And our plan is already delivering results. Our emissions are down 20% on the 2005 levels. They've fallen faster than Canada, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, the OECD average, Mr Speaker. And we're on track to meet and beat our 2030 targets, Mr Speaker, and central to that has been world-beating levels of installation of solar, farming practices we just heard about from the Minister for Agriculture, of course, energy efficiency in manufacturing and elsewhere, Mr Speaker. But it's not just enough to reduce our emissions. It's not just enough to reduce our emissions. Countries across the world need to reduce their emissions, and that's the opportunity that technology provides, and that's why we've committed $568 million to low emissions technology partnerships across the world. We've already signed agreements with the UK, Japan, Singapore and Germany to lower emissions technologies like hydrogen, healthy soils, green steel, clean steel, Mr Speaker. These are actions and outcomes that matter. Now, we are getting on with the job, and that's the Australian way, but I am asked about alternatives. And the alternative is what's offered by those opposite who refuse to tell Australians what their 2030 target is, Mr Speaker. They refuse to tell Australians what their 2030 target. Now, the essence of the Paris Agreement, central to the Paris Agreement, is having a 2030 target, Mr Speaker. Well, they don't want to talk about a 2030 target, Mr Speaker. They don't want to talk about the plan either. They don't have a plan. There is no plan. They just want to talk Australia down, Mr Speaker. They want to talk Australia down. Well, that's not the Australian way. The Australian way is to deliver, to get on with the job. Our track record of delivery is one that all Australians can be proud of.
The member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On 24 June, 8 days after the Bondi cluster began, the Prime Minister commended the Premier of New South Wales for resisting a lockdown. Melbourne had tackled an outbreak of the Delta strain less than a month earlier. How many people have contracted COVID and been hospitalised since the Prime Minister told the Premier she should resist taking necessary action to keep the community safe?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The figures I have that there are 297 people in New South Wales who are currently in hospital, 60 are in ICU, 28 are on ventilators, Mr Speaker. There were 356 cases today. Mr Speaker, I addressed this matter in a question, I think it was last week, in the same, or recently, Mr Speaker, when the same matter was raised. And it has been the case that in the past that New South Wales has had success in being able to contain outbreaks and to be able to remain open. That is true. They were able to do that, Mr Speaker, because New South Wales has been acknowledged as having one of the best testing, tracing, isolate and quarantine systems not just in Australia, Mr Speaker, but in the world. But there have certainly been lessons learned over the course of these many past weeks, Mr Speaker, and the government doesn't deny that. And that's why when we came together as a National Cabinet, Mr Speaker, we came, Mr Speaker, to the agreed position right across the National Cabinet, Mr Speaker, that it was necessary in Phase A of this national plan that short, sharp lockdowns is what is necessary in response to the Delta variant. And, Mr Speaker, that is the response that the federal government supports. And when, Mr Speaker—
Members on my left will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And that is why we are backing up that policy with the economic supports that are put in place with the COVID disaster assistance payment, which commences from the first day of any lockdown, Mr Speaker, consistent with the declaration of a Commonwealth hotspot. It is why we have entered into financial support agreements with the states and territories, whether it be in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Mr Speaker, to provide 50-50 support in funding the necessary business supports to make those lockdowns a success. It is why the ADF is sent in, Mr Speaker. It is why we have redirected, or pulled forward, I should say, Mr Speaker, doses of particularly the Pfizer vaccine. As I've said, 386 million already, 386,000, Mr Speaker, being brought forward on top of the existing allocations to New South Wales to address this outbreak in New South Wales. Mr Speaker, the Delta strain is a great challenge for the country. It's a great challenge for New South Wales right now, and we're going to continue working together to combat the Delta strain in New South Wales, Mr Speaker, and ensure that we all get through this. And I would seek the support, Mr Speaker, of all in this chamber to support that program, Mr Speaker, and not undermine those efforts.
The member for Leichhardt has the call.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister advise the House on the Morrison government's world-leading approach to the protection of our oceans and our marine parks, and more particularly our Great Barrier Reef?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure to take a question from the member for Leichhardt, our dynamic reef envoy, championing the reef on the national and international stage. And I want to thank him for his recent work leading a field trip of ambassadors to the reef to demonstrate the management that Australia takes so seriously, introducing the scientists, the work that's happening, the marine park managers. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is deeply invested in protecting the World Heritage listed Great Barrier Reef. The tourism industry, traditional owners, farmers, fishers, scientists, marine park managers, reef communities all rely on our commitment to the reef, demonstrated by a $3 billion joint investment with the Queensland Government. Benchmarked against global standards, Australia's management of the reef is considered by many to be the gold standard. And this was acknowledged recently by the technical experts to the World Heritage Committee, whose advice in the lead-up to this year's meeting said that it commends the state party, Australia, for the strong and continued efforts to create conditions for the implementation of the Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan, including through unprecedented financial commitments. The centrepiece of Australia's reef protection efforts is indeed the Reef 2050 plan. And, Mr Speaker, the core proposition of this plan is how we make the reef as healthy and resilient as it possibly can be in the face of its biggest challenge, climate change. The plan is being delivered and it's achieving results. We've reduced pressures on the reef, we've built reef resilience, and we've strengthened partnerships for the future. We're pleased that a bid by UNESCO to endanger list the Great Barrier Reef was overwhelmingly rejected by the World Heritage Committee at the recent 44th session. In fact, the words "in danger" did not appear anywhere on the final decision. 20 of 21 members of the committee spoke in support of Australia's position that the reef should not be in danger listing, an overwhelming consensus. And it's not just the Great Barrier Reef where we're leading the world in environmental management, Mr Speaker. As part of the last budget, we had a $100 million investment to continue our world and region-leading work. Blue carbon technology, plastic out of the oceans, restoring ecosystems and contributing to the global task of reducing emissions. This builds on our re-establishment of oyster reefs along the coastline, our determination to tackle ghost nets, those walls of death in the water, our beach cleanups in communities up and down our coastline. We are recognised as a global leader in ocean protection, assisting our Pacific neighbours, leading by example in our domestic waters, and we will continue to protect the iconic Great Barrier Reef.
And I call the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. The Morrison government promised aged care workers would be fully vaccinated against COVID by Easter. 4 months on, more than half are still waiting. Today, the New South Wales Minister for Health said he'd never been asked by the Morrison government to put in place an order for mandatory vaccination of aged care workers. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility for his mess, which is leaving vulnerable Australians at risk?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will ask the Minister for Health and Aged Care to add to this answer. Mr Speaker, the matter of mandatory vaccinations of aged care workers was the subject of a National Cabinet decision attended by the Premier of New South Wales, where all Mr Speaker, with the exception of Victoria and the ACT, who have a different set of arrangements that relate to public health orders relating to aged care, all, including the New South Wales Premier, agreed to put in place those public health orders, and I had received several updates from the Premier of New South Wales about their progress towards achieving that. Now, I can only refer to those matters as they've been discussed between myself as Prime Minister and the Premier of New South Wales. I can't speak to the state of knowledge of the Minister for Health in New South Wales, but I'll ask the Minister for Health and Aged Care to add further to the answer.
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And in relation to aged care staff, at this stage, the latest advice I have is that there have been 158,204 first vaccinations, or 57.5% of the workforce, 102,771 or 37.3% of the workforce, or 260,975 all up. As the Prime Minister said, in relation to the very constructive work we've been able to do with all states and territories, on the 28th of June of 2021, National Cabinet met and agreed to mandate that at least the first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine be administered by mid-September 2021. That work has been carried on the 28th of July and the 4th of August in discussions by the Aged Care Advisory Committee of the Medical Expert Panel, the AHPPC. On the 2nd of August, the AHPPC approved and published the guidelines, which were then published on the 3rd of August, mandatory vaccination of residential aged care workers. That's publicly available. AHPPC has been meeting daily, and this has been raised on multiple occasions on the advice of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Michael Kidd, to me today. And on the 10th of August, following the West Australian Public Health Order, further discussion at AHPPC, and indeed the West Australian Chief Health Officer only yesterday published the Residential Aged Care Facility Worker Access Directions. It's also been raised in Health Ministers' meetings as a matter, and what we're seeing is all states and territories making very good progress, not just with the vaccinations, but also with the orders. We thank Western Australia for their work. We thank all the states and territories for their cooperation.
And I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Can the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is backing Australian ingenuity and innovation to reduce emissions here and around the world? Is the Minister aware of anything that might stand in the way of this approach?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Sturt for his question, for his commitment to technology-led approaches to bringing down emissions. And of course, he knows that in Australia we have some of the best and brightest when it comes to low emissions technologies, and we're backing them. We're backing them in South Australia in places like the world-leading hydrogen park at Tonsley. Mr Speaker, we're backing Australian innovation and ingenuity. Now, we're backing them to get that balance right between healthy environment and healthy economy, Mr Speaker, and that's what it's all about. And the way to do that is with technology-driven approaches in places like Gladstone, where we're backing hydrogen for the alumina refinery there. We're backing our dairy farmers to bring down emissions and bring down the cost of their energy at places like Nowra, where we've recently backed a microgrid for the dairy farmers there, one which can then be replicated across dairy farms right across Australia. And we're backing regional communities, including in the member for INDI's electorate. We were talking about microgrids just earlier, Mr Speaker. We're backing a 7-fold increase in electric vehicle charging stations. Mr Speaker, the change is happening and we want to see more of it. Now, Mr Speaker, that's why we've expanded ARENA. That's why we've expanded ARENA so that it can invest in all technologies. Clean hydrogen, wherever the clean hydrogen might come from, Mr Speaker. Low emission steel and aluminium. Healthy soil, soil carbon, Mr Speaker. Stored energy. All of those technologies are part of a portfolio which have the potential to eliminate or substantially reduce emissions in sectors responsible for 90% of not just Australia's emissions but the world's emissions, Mr Speaker. That's our commitment. Now, I was asked about things that stand in the way of this approach, Mr Speaker, and those opposite are standing in the way of investment in more technology, because it was just last week that they teamed up with the Greens to vote against the technology investment roadmap, Mr Speaker. They want to put a handbrake on new technologies that will bring down emissions, strengthen industry, strengthen manufacturing, strengthen agriculture in this country. And not once, Mr Speaker, but 4 times now, they have teamed up with the Greens to vote against low emissions technologies, Mr Speaker. Now, if it isn't to be technology, it is to be taxes, and we know those opposite have never seen a tax they don't like, Mr Speaker. Their track record is to solve problems through taxation. That's not our approach. We won't vandalise our economy, Mr Speaker. And we're getting on with the job of delivering emissions reduction through a technology-led approach.
The member for MacArthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the government's announcement that doses of the Moderna vaccine will be available from September. Can the Prime Minister confirm Moderna has been administered in the United States since December last year, in France, Germany and Italy since January, in Singapore since March, and in the UK and Canada since April, and in Japan since May?
The Minister for Health has the call. Members on my left, the Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm happy to take those dates on notice, but my understanding is that they are correct. In addition to that, though, what we have done in Australia is we've put in place a system which included 6 principal contracts for vaccine acquisition in Australia. That includes, firstly, 40 million Pfizer vaccines. We're in that process. Secondly, we have the AstraZeneca vaccines of over 53 million which have been acquired, and it's very important that, but for the fact that we made the decision for sovereign vaccine manufacturing, it is clear that we would have not been able to have received the vast majority of those. And we did that in light of the times that were available for international distributions of vaccines to Australia and New Zealand. In addition to that, we've acquired 51 million Novavax. We also placed an order for over 50 million University of Queensland molecular clamp vaccines. That was not ultimately successful, but I think it was an important investment. And we've also acquired enough for every Australian for the COVAX facility. As well as that, there are 25 million Moderna vaccines. That approval, which the TGA has now completed and which I welcome, leads us to be able to deliver that vaccine commencing in the second half of September, subject to final confirmation of supply arrangements. But on the advice that I had on the weekend, that remains the expected time frame for the first of those 10 million doses this year. Next year, of course, we have the 15 million additional doses of Moderna, and beyond that we also have over 60 million doses of Pfizer. What does all of this mean? It means that Australia has sufficient supply to deliver the opportunity for every Australian to be vaccinated during the course of this year, and to be vaccinated safely, to have that approval. From the medical regulator. There were those who were urging that these processes be skipped. There were those who were casting doubt on AstraZeneca during the course of this year. If you'd like me to answer who cast doubt on AstraZeneca, then I'm very happy to do that. And if I may, feels like Australia is being shortchanged with an inferior vaccine of AstraZeneca. The issue, though, is that the rest of the country is going to be offered a lower efficacious vaccine, the AstraZeneca. The person in question is Michelle Ananda Raj, the hand-picked candidate for Higgins.
Just before I go to the next question, the Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. And that is a perfect example for members of the House. If they interject and the minister responds to it, they might rethink why they're interjecting and whether that's a good idea. The member for Forde.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister please update the House on the outcome of police attending to the so-called protests that took place this morning in Canberra?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
I thank the member for his question. The incidents this morning that were conducted outside this place were not conducted in the usual peaceful way that we are accustomed to seeing events taking place outside this place. They were not registered and they were not expected. And frankly, they weren't protests. So let's call it what it is. It was premeditated vandalism and property damage. Now, the Australian Federal Police responded very quickly to both of these incidents, and 8 people have been arrested. 3 offenders were put under arrest at the lodge, and AFP officers arrested a further 5 offenders at Parliament House. So once again, the AFP has been at the front line, and I thank them for their ongoing dedication to keeping our community here safe. Now, I join with the Prime Minister and other members of this place in saying that this sort of violent, damaging protest has no place in Australian political debate. And I think Australians will be very shocked by the scenes that they will see replayed out the front and in our national capital today, because they know that this is not how we get a point across in Australia. We all condemn this sort of willful, planned behaviour, which frankly endangers protesters, public and law enforcement officers alike. This is not the Australian way. And I'd also like to make the point, as I did when my own office was vandalised about a month ago, that damage to public property is not a minor matter, and it ends up costing every single taxpayer. It's stupid, it's unnecessary, and it's against the law. And I say to these people that when you damage public property, you do even more damage to your own cause. Now, the right to protest is a fundamental right in our society, and we all respect peaceful protests that are conducted safely and lawfully. But our government will not be swayed by attempts to intimidate through violence or destruction, and our law enforcement agencies will respond swiftly and decisively, as they have today, to incidents of this nature.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Does the Minister support the creation of electronic vaccination certificates which passengers will need to fly within Australia and overseas?
I just call the Leader of the House.
Not every issue that might end up with some relationship to an airplane should be able to be answered by the particular minister in question. I think that there are clearly other ministers. There are clearly other ministers, and predominantly and primarily and substantively that is a health issue.
I will. Members on my left, particularly the member for Solomon, never help when I'm hearing points of order. And if they're not convinced about never helping me, I hope they're convinced they're not helping the Manager of Opposition Business. Manager of Opposition Business on the point of order.
On the point of order, Mr Speaker, this question asks the Minister who, as far as the House is concerned, is responsible for answering questions on aviation about the rules as to whether people are allowed to fly. Now, this is not a long bow in terms of responsibility. This is about whether people get to fly, and he's meant to be able to answer questions on aviation policy. There would be a whole series of dixes that are out of order routinely if the aviation minister can't tell us an answer on the rules about whether or not people are allowed to fly.
The Leader of the House on the point of order.
Mr Speaker, I understand the point about rules, but those rules either would emanate from state-based public health acts or—
No, hang on. Members on my left.
Or
this
the
is
Commonwealth—
not, no, hang on. The Leader of the House will— This is not a debate.
Or the Commonwealth Biosecurity Act, which means that they would necessarily be a question directed to the Health Minister, or alternatively they would emanate from workplace relations law, in which case it would be another minister entirely.
I'm just going to rule on this question without going through the practice again in great detail. And I take the points each are making, but I do think ministers have got as the practice points out, have got the ability to refer questions to other ministers if, in their opinion, the matters are more of a responsibility for other ministers. That principle is there. It doesn't mean the questions can't be asked, but I think on this occasion the point the Leader of the House is making has some validity to it, because it wouldn't be something a minister responsible for aviation would make on their own. It would be something that would be enacted as a result of decisions of other ministries. The Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question, and as I would hope not only the member and those opposite would appreciate that the Deputy Prime Minister is unable to attend and was in fact planning to be here this week but couldn't inadvertently because of COVID. And obviously we are working through the arrangements, and I am acting on his behalf. I am prepared to obviously take that on notice and work with the other relevant agencies such as Health, the Attorney-General, Workplace Minister, to make sure that there is an appropriate answer to that asked. But if those opposite were serious about this, they would have made sure that they appropriated it to the appropriate minister.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Will the Minister please update the House on what action the Morrison-Joyce government is taking to protect regional, rural and remote Australians in the fight against the COVID pandemic?
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank the member for Cowper for his question and acknowledge his deep concern for the welfare of his constituents, and that's evidenced by his wonderful, stellar career serving in the New South Wales Police Force and defending people as a lawyer. He's also spoken up to defend the rights of his constituents and make sure they are getting the same care that everyone else in Australia is getting. The Morrison-Joyce government is delivering across our wide brown land, and I can tell the House that 3.7 million doses of vaccines have already been delivered to 2.5 million individuals in regional and rural Australia. The state system is obviously supported. The states all get support from the Commonwealth Government, whether you're getting your vaccine in one of the state systems or the general practices, the community vaccination centres, the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, the pharmacies or even the flying doctor service. Now, the brunt of the delivery of the vaccine has been from the beginning through general practices. There's 1,500 in regional and rural Australia who are delivering vaccines and have been. More are coming on board as well. 73 of the community Commonwealth vaccination centres are indeed in regional Australia. There are 125 Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations that have delivered to 148,000 Indigenous and other people who attend their centres. We have also announced that in remote Australia and in Indigenous communities, Pfizer is available, including to 12 to 15-year-olds and those with chronic medical conditions. Many of my former medical colleagues in general practice who are bearing up well under this huge program are welcoming, and many of my constituents are too, the enrolment of pharmacies into delivering vaccines as well. We have 375 already delivering in regional Australia, including in the good members' electorate. Plunkett's Pharmacy will come on board next week, and they have a branch also in my hometown of Wauchope. Olbar, also in my electorate, has already delivered, Olbar Pharmacy has already delivered 500, and they've only been getting vaccines for a couple of weeks. Now, I spoke with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and Frank Quinlan told me that they've been to 95 different places, whether it's Broome in the northwest or Blackhole in the middle of Queensland. When they turned up in Tibooburra, the Bush Telegraph was alive and well. They had 7 people booked in, but they called past the pub, and by the time they flew out, they delivered 70. So the Bush Telegraph is alive and well. And I'd also like to thank Tyrone Hand when they turned up at Fitzroy Crossing.
Concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. This Parliament applauds the sacrifices made by the Australian people to keep each other safe. The Parliament thanks the heroes of the pandemic, our scientists, doctors, nurses, aged care and disability workers, cleaners and other essential workers. This House condemns the comments of the member for Dawson prior to question time designed to use our national parliament to spread misinformation and undermine the actions of Australians to defeat COVID. The House rejects statements that masks don't work, lockdowns don't work, and the describing of our health professionals as, quote, dictatorial medical bureaucrats. The House calls on all members to refrain from making ill-informed comments at a time when the pandemic represents a serious threat to the health of Australians.
Is leave granted? Is leave granted? The Leader of the House?
Leave is granted.
The Manager of Opposition Business has the call. No, after his speech is when I'd ask for a seconder. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just prior to question time, in the key position, the last Speaker for the government, one which to expose for the Australian public tactics on both sides of the House, that's the key slot prior to 2 p.m. that occurs in the Parliament. The government chose to give that spot to the member for Dawson, which is why I move the motion that is before me that I've read out before. The fact is that the member for Dawson has engaged in behaviour over hydroxychloroquine, over unproven and indeed dangerous remedies which are completely contradictory to the scientific advice and the advice of our health professionals. There's been some debate, Mr. Speaker, in this parliament about the two jobs that we say, and indeed the Prime Minister said when he addressed the National Press Club in January of this year, had as the priority for the government: the rollout of the vaccine and quarantine facilities that are purpose-built and keep people safe. And the fact is that when it comes to the rollout of the vaccine, our scientists have done an absolutely magnificent job. There's a debate over the speed in which our rollout has been, because when it looks at the rollout, the fact is we are last in the developed world, and we're struggling to get in the top 80 in the entire world for the rollout of the vaccine. But last year, when companies like Moderna and Pfizer were promoting the idea of an mRNA vaccine, there was some scepticism as to whether it could be achieved and what the time frame would be. But as we asked in questions today about Moderna, in between the outbreak of COVID-19 originating in China and the end of the year, the end of 2020, Moderna had already delivered 100 million vaccinations to the US government. Pfizer was being delivered. Our scientists and our health professionals performed miracles to take what was an unknown disease, beginning in China and then spreading around the world, and coming up with real solutions based upon science. And what parliaments have done around the world, and the Australian people have been magnificent on, is responding to the threat that this pandemic represented. Australians have listened to the advice of our health professionals. They have made sacrifices. They've stayed at home. They've kept safe from each other. They have, in many cases, made sacrifices that have cost their jobs, that have cost their incomes, and certainly every Australian's way of life has been impacted as a result of this. But what we have had throughout this pandemic is also a very small minority of people, a small minority of people here in Australia, but also overseas, and we saw the actions certainly in the United States leading up to some of the conspiracy theorists leading to a raid on the White House in January earlier this year. But here we have had, through Facebook, through a range of social media posts, the promotion of, frankly, ideas not based upon science, based upon conspiracies, based upon spreading fear, based upon spreading misinformation. And we saw the end result of those consequences in those rallies that took place just weeks ago. The violent rally in Sydney, which should have been condemned, and anyone promoting it should have been condemned, just like the minister was quite right to condemn any violence and inappropriate way of protesting that occurred outside this parliament and at the Prime Minister's residence earlier today. But what we saw, down to the punching of a horse, down to the attacks on police, the attacks on those brave men and women who take the duty of keeping us safe, was people having those mass demonstrations in order to promote civil disobedience. And you would think that for many people, they might have been on the fringe of society. They'd heard misinformation. They were concerned about the sacrifices that they were being asked to make and didn't have a clear explanation as to why. And for many people who turned up just frustrated, you can perhaps think maybe they were just misguided. But for a member of the House of Representatives, as the member for Dawson did, to attend a rally in Mackay supporting these violent demonstrations that took place is an insult to those heroes of the pandemic. And that's why this motion recognises our scientists, our doctors, our nurses, our aged care and disability workers, our cleaners, our truck drivers, our supermarket workers, who've made all of those sacrifices to keep us safe. And yet what we have is a member of the government, a member of the Liberal National Party, coming into this parliament and in the key slot before question time promoting these conspiracy theories, saying that it's okay to say, as he did in his contribution, to say masks don't work, fact, to say lockdowns don't destroy the virus, but they do destroy people's livelihoods and people's lives. To say, to refer to our medical heroes not as being heroes of the pandemic, but as dictatorial medical bureaucrats need to recognise these facts and stop spreading fear. And then to go on to say this, at a time when, in the last days, each and every day, there have been fatalities in New South Wales, including over the weekend, one of my constituents, a constituent in an aged care home in Summerhill, who caught the virus because an aged care worker had not been fully vaccinated, because they had not been kept safe. Right. And what we have from this Member of Parliament, some people will catch it. Tragically, some people will die from it. That's inevitable and we have to accept it. That's what he said. That's what he said. He then went on to say, open society back up, restore our freedoms, end this madness. Well, I'll tell you what madness is. Madness is saying, let this disease rip. Let people die. Let whole economies be shut down. Let's stop us being able to return to our way of life. That is what is madness. The madness of conspiracy theorists, the madness of the rump in the National Party who replaced the former Deputy Prime Minister as its leader, as a result of being prepared, this tail wagging the National Party dog because the former Deputy Prime Minister wouldn't have a bar of this sort of nonsense, but the current one is quite happy to give it a tick. And the Liberal and National parties are quite happy to give a voice to the member for Dawson. He's not sitting on the crossbench. I'll tell you why. When we'll take you seriously in terms of the government, we'll take the government seriously when the member for Dawson is expelled from the party and is sitting over there with the member for Hughes. Because the member for Hughes has also sprouted these sort of conspiracy theories and when it's allowed to do it day after day, week after week, month after month, at a time when our heroes of the pandemic are doing great work each and every day, being undermined by someone paid for by the taxpayer with the great honour of sitting in this House of Representatives. But with that great honour of sitting in the House of Representatives comes obligation. An obligation to be fair income. An obligation to promote truth. An obligation not to promote conspiracy theories. An obligation to listen to the health professionals. And the health professionals have had a difficult task. It is true that this was not anticipated. Anyone early in 2019 who would have said at the time of the contest of the last election that this would be a dominant issue during this term of parliament, not even Nostradamus could have done that. But the fact is that Australians in workplaces, some of the poorest paid Australians, our cleaners, those people who look after people in aged care homes, risking their lives, going in, helping vulnerable Australians each and every day, being prepared to do that. Aged care workers who were told they would be fully vaccinated by Easter, but who were then told, no, just go and see a doctor, you're on your own when it comes to being vaccinated. They are our heroes, and they deserve so much better. Our people in disability care, who have, we learnt yesterday, under 40% vaccinated, pretty close to 1 in 3, and under half of our aged care workers. They are our heroes. They deserve our thanks and our gratitude. But what they get is an insult from the member for Dawson. But what's worse is those people who are members of grieving families today to actually hear in our national parliament a member of parliament stand up and essentially say, as he did explicitly, not essentially, COVID-19 is going to be with us forever, just like the flu. This is not the same as the flu. This is not the same as the flu. This is something that has had the member for Dawson said, and just like the flu, we will have to live with it, not the constant fear of it. Well, I've got to say this. I'm scared, and Australians are scared of COVID. There is fear because they're fearful of something that's scary. This is having an impact. People are dying. People are dying. People are getting sick. There are almost 30 people in hospital today who are on ventilators, being kept alive by the machine. There are more than almost double that, or around about double that, who are in hospital, in ICU. This is a scary disease. It requires an appropriate response. This parliament needs to dissociate itself from the member for Dawson's comments. It was let go for far too long with the mad theories about what drugs people should do. You know, we didn't quite have what we had in the United States of, drinking bleach and various things. But we've had quite inappropriate theories promoted by the member for Dawson, and that's why this should be supported. And that's why the member for MacArthur has seconded this motion.
Not yet, he hasn't.
As a doctor, he will be. As a doctor,
it's called anticipating debate.
As someone who is a strong advocate for people's health and someone who has played such a constructive role during this pandemic.
Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion. The member, and I reserve my right to speak.
The question is that the motion be, I'll say at this point, disagreed to or agreed to. We can work that out down the track. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 20th of January 2020, the National Incident Room for COVID-19 was activated by the government. Mr Speaker, it wasn't until the 12th of March that the World Health Organisation declared a COVID-19 pandemic. But, Mr Speaker, by that time, Australia had already called it. Australia had already begun its response. Australia had already closed its borders. And, Mr Speaker, it was only the day after that the governments of Australia, the states and territories, came together. I remember the day very, very well, out in Western Sydney at Bankwest Stadium. And as we were updated during the course of that meeting at the rapid escalation in cases that had been unanticipated, I recall at the commencement of that meeting, the then Chief Medical Officer, Brendan Murphy, had already reported to the Premiers and the Chief Ministers and myself, and those who were also in attendance that day. The Governor of the Reserve Bank was also there today, on that day, to speak about what the potential economic consequences of this were. And, Mr Speaker, the head of the National Coordinating Mechanism that had been set up in the Department of Home Affairs to ensure there was an integration between industry and business and governments in handling our response to the pandemic. And later that day, on the 13th, we agreed that the Federation would have to operate in a very different way to which it has done throughout its entire history. And since that day, we have come together as Australians of different political persuasions, of governments, small and large, to work together to manage our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. On 50 occasions. On 50 occasions we have met. In good faith and in a good sense to take the steps necessary needed to protect Australian lives and protect Australian livelihoods. And it's true, Mr Speaker, over the course of that time till this, no government has got everything right, whether here in Australia or anywhere else around the world. But I remember those fears at that time very vividly. I remember the fears of what this could do to our most vulnerable communities. And I particularly recall, and I remember discussing it with the Minister for Indigenous Australians, the community we feared for most was Indigenous Australians. The impact that that would have. We thought across our country where we have strong public health systems, and aren't we grateful for that and the investments that we've made in our health systems in this country? We knew that that would provide us and afford us some measure of protections, and we're also thinking of what this might mean for the countries around and about us, particularly our Pacific family and friends, and what this virus may do to them. And we're already activating and engaging with them as to how we might help them through this crisis. And if I told you on that day, on the 13th of March of 2020, that roll forward 18 months as the world was struck down by this pandemic, if I told you that over that next 18 months, Australia would have one of the lowest fatality rates in the world and will have saved over 30,000 lives compared to like countries just like Australia. If I told you we were going to go into recession at that time because of the pandemic, Mr Speaker, people certainly would have believed me when I said that. But if I told you that in less than 12 months from that, 1 million people would be back in work and Australia's economy would be stronger at the other side, Mr Speaker, at that point than when it was before. If I told you that we'd work together with the states and territories, where around about 500,000 people would come through our borders, and the quarantine system put together by states and territories with the Commonwealth would mean a 99.9% effective rate in stopping the transmission of the virus, as those more than 500,000 or about 500,000, Mr Speaker, came to the country. You wouldn't have believed me. And those opposite might mock, Mr Speaker. Those opposite might mock. But, Mr Speaker, this is what Australians have achieved. More than 30,000 lives saved, Mr Speaker. Working with our industry and business, JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, COVID supplement, cash flow bonus, Mr Speaker, now the COVID disaster payment. Australians have been carrying Australians through this crisis, Mr Speaker. Australians have been carrying Australians through this crisis, and they have had the great support of their governments at unprecedented levels in working each and every day as a Team Australia, Mr Speaker, to get this as right as we possibly can. And Mr Speaker, one of the key things we have done throughout this is we have been informed by the best possible medical advice, by the best medical advisors in the world, Mr Speaker. Whether it be the Therapeutic Goods Administration, whether it be our Chief Medical Officer, whether it be the expert medical panel. Mr Speaker, all of these organisations informing us. These groups have been meeting almost on a daily basis, Mr Speaker, for 18 months. And my government, Mr Speaker, and the governments led around this country has listened carefully and taken that advice, Mr Speaker, and acted accordingly, and Australia together has saved lives and saved livelihoods. That is what we've done, Mr Speaker, and that's why my government does not support misinformation in any way, shape or form. We do not, Mr Speaker. That is not the position of the government. And my government will not support those statements, Mr Speaker, where there is misinformation that is out and about in the community, whether it's posted, Mr Speaker, on Facebook, or it's posted in social media, or it's written in articles or made statements, whether in this chamber, Mr Speaker, or anywhere else. But, Mr Speaker, what I'm not going to do, Mr Speaker, is I'm not going to engage in a partisan debate on this. I'm not, Mr Speaker. Because what I know is Australians aren't interested in the politics of COVID. They're not interested in the noise of COVID. Mr Speaker, they're not interested in the shouting of COVID. What they're interested in, Mr Speaker, is that we make our Australian way through this crisis. And I tell you what, our Australian way through this crisis has stood tall in the world. Australians' role in this crisis has stood tall in the world. Whether it's Bill Gates, Mr Speaker, or whether it's others who have looked at what has happened around the world and they've said, you know, Australia has stood out. Now, we haven't got everything right, but where we haven't, Mr Speaker, I tell you we've applied ourselves to address those problems, to fix those problems and get it right, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it doesn't matter how you start the race, Mr Speaker, it's how you finish the race. It's how you finish the race, Mr Speaker. And we are going to finish this race as a government, Mr Speaker, when it comes to this issue. We are going to finish this race, Mr Speaker, and we're going to run that race all the way to the finish line, Mr Speaker, but we're going to do it as Team Australia. We're not going to do it in a way, Mr Speaker, which seeks to divide Australians and set Australians one against the other. We're not going to do it in a way, Mr Speaker, which seeks to demonise people in this country. We're going to listen carefully to the people of Australia. We're going to listen carefully to their anxieties and concerns, and we're going to work with them. Our vaccine, Mr Speaker, is free. Our vaccine is not mandatory, Mr Speaker. It is necessary that during the suppression phase we have the lockdowns and we have the restrictions, Mr Speaker, and they are necessary for the public health of this nation. So, Mr Speaker, my government, Mr Speaker, will continue to focus at the job at hand. My government will continue to focus on the public health of Australians. It will continue to focus on working together with Australians, not to set them apart from one another, Mr Speaker. My government will focus on the results that Australians want to achieve. Others, Mr Speaker, it is up to them. If they want to undermine that effort, Mr Speaker, with misinformation, if they want to undermine that effort, Mr Speaker, by undermining the government's attempts and talking Australia down, Mr Speaker, if they wish to do that, that is a matter for them. My government, Mr Speaker, will remain focused on the public health, the lives and livelihoods of Australians. As we continue to roll out the vaccine, Mr Speaker, we will have, by the end of this year, we will be able to say, Mr Speaker, that we have saved the lives of over 30,000 Australians. We have put 1 million people back into work, Mr Speaker, and we have vaccinated the country, Mr Speaker, and we're achieving the goals that we have set. Mr Speaker, that is what Australians are focused on. They're interested in their health, their jobs, their futures, Mr Speaker. They're not interested in the politics of COVID. They're not interested, Mr Speaker, in the phony debates, Mr Speaker. What they're interested in, Mr Speaker, is the results of Australian lives and livelihoods being saved, Mr Speaker. That's what we're focused on. That's what we will focus on every single day. We do not support misinformation in any way, shape or form.
Has concluded. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to, and I call the member for MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. So,
15 minutes, and like Voldemort, he couldn't even mention the member for Dawson's name. So the race that was not a race is now a race. Now, for me, this is very, very personal. I've been contacted on multiple occasions in the last few weeks from my medical colleagues, from my relatives who work on the front line in intensive care, in hospitals that are really under the pump, under pressure because of the outbreak that's occurring in Sydney. 356 cases today, 60 in ICU, many on ventilators, 6 deaths associated with the outbreak at Liverpool Hospital because of a healthcare worker who was infected. To have the Leader of the Opposition move this motion today, I can only say thank God and thank you. It is about time those in government called to account those on their side who are undermining our response to the pandemic, to those whose statements are costing lives, and to those who are doing everything they can to undermine our national response to which is to something that's the biggest health crisis in over a century. And I don't just mean the member for Dawson, the member for Hughes, of course, the captain's pick at the last election, Senator Rennick, Senator Canavan and others who are doing their best to cause increasing fear, increasing distrust, and are undermining our response to the critical time in this pandemic. This Delta variant, make no mistake, is a different game. This is something that we still do not know how it's going to end. And we have to do everything we can to maximise our response, to maximise our immunisation rates, to maximise our social distancing, to make sure that people who are, of course, fearful, and with fear comes distrust, of course they're fearful as to what's happening. Many in my electorate have lost their livelihoods. Many in my electorate cannot see how they're going to pay the next mortgage repayment, who can't see how they can protect their own kids, who can't see their kids even going back to school. And yet we have people on the government benches who are actively undermining our response. Now, I don't like to see healthcare workers as heroes. And I'm sure the member for Higgins can understand this. What they do is they get up every day and they go to work, some of them putting their lives at risk because that's the job they do, because they care about people and they want to make sure that our response is the best that it possibly can be. And that's just the job they sign up for. The nurses, the doctors, the cleaners, the pathology technicians, they're the people that save lives. I don't save lives sitting here as a Member of Parliament, but I recognise that it is a huge privilege. And with that privilege comes a huge responsibility. And when I see people on any side of politics doing active harm to our response to this crisis, this health crisis, it just makes me angry. They should not be ignored. They should be called out on every occasion, because what they are doing is disgraceful. And I think any sensible person would understand that the time has to come when they should be called out. Now, we've seen in countries like India and Brazil and Indonesia, thousands, hundreds of thousands, indeed even millions of deaths. And to call this
pandemic or this virus like the flu, surely that is beyond any reason, beyond any acceptability. And yet we have a government, a Prime Minister and members of the government who ignore it, don't call it out, allow it to be propagated in social media, on the national media as acceptable is just wrong. The member for Dawson needs to be called out. The member for Hughes needs to be called out. The senators need to be called out because we need to recognise the harm that they are doing. The Prime Minister was right. We have fantastic medical professionals in infectious diseases, epidemiology, vaccines, and we are very grateful to have them and very grateful for the way that they have tried their very best to keep us all safe. But to see members of the government and members of other political parties as well doing what they can to destroy our response and not criticise them, not call them out, is just wrong. I should also mention a previous member of this House, Clive Palmer. Shameful what he's doing. He is actually letterboxing and messaging those in some of the most vulnerable electorates in Sydney, trying to undermine our response to this pandemic. Now, every one of us should take that responsibility very, very seriously. And I know most members of the government do, but I think it is no longer acceptable to ignore the absolutely disgraceful comments from the member for Dawson, things like masks don't work, masks make no significant difference to the spread of COVID-19, lockdowns don't work, lockdowns don't destroy the virus but they destroy people's livelihoods. Imagine if you're locked down in Sydney and you're a tradesman or a manual worker and you're hearing this message from a member of Parliament. Imagine what that does to your confidence in the advice, the medical advice you're being given. Now just think about that. All of us in this place have a responsibility to keep people safe. What we do does actually matter. We're not there in intensive care sucking the secretions out of people who have a tube down their throat, breathing with the use of a respirator. We're not there with people who aren't able to visit their grieving mother or father who is terminally ill with COVID-19. But we can make a difference. And we can make a difference by calling out people who actively seek to undermine our response. I'm so grateful for the Leader of the Opposition moving this motion. It's one that everyone in this House should support. And I think it is time that we did all work together and condemn these people. Condemn members of our Parliament that are undermining our response to this great health crisis. Condemn those in the media who are doing the same thing, who are undermining our response. We all have to do that. If we all do it together, that's what will make a difference. I worry about all my colleagues and my relatives who are working at the front line of healthcare because they are putting their lives at risk. And if we can reduce the number of patients in intensive care, if we can reduce that risk for our healthcare workers, that is a very, very good thing. They are doing the job that they signed up to do, to keep us safe. And I mentioned also our police forces who are charged with compliance and making sure people do the right thing. They are doing in Sydney at the moment a fantastic job as well. And I really fully respect the very softly approach that the New South Wales Police have taken to this, and I congratulate them on the job that they are doing. But as leaders in our community, all of us should be doing the right thing, and we should be calling out those, like the member for Dawson and others, who are actively seeking for their own benefit to undermine our response. Thank you.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Question is the motion be agreed to?
Speaker, I move that the question be put.
Well, hang on. The question is the motion be agreed to. No, hang on. Member for Newcastle, just you're a member of the Speaker's panel. Question is the motion be agreed to. No one else has risen to speak, so I'll just put the question that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. So that was quite a long debate. We're back to no. The call will alternate. No, that's a bit. We're back to question time. So no, that's okay. The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, and I ask the Minister if he could please update the House on how the Morrison government's modern manufacturing strategy is driving low emissions technology and creating jobs.
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and for his great support and continued support of manufacturing and his very, very large electorate. And even during COVID, with the challenges that have been faced by Australian manufacturing, exports and profitability of Australian manufacturing have demonstrated the resilience of the sector and the future contribution that the sector can make to clean energy in Australia and indeed the world. And through the first phase of COVID, in the March quarter 2021, manufacturing profits rose by 6.8% and were 16% higher over the year, a remarkable achievement given what those industries have endured during that first phase of COVID. In fact, manufacturing gross operating profits were up $38 billion in the year to March 2021, which represented an 8.5% of the total profits across all Australian industries, which is again a remarkable result. And the monthly exports of manufactured goods increased in June 2021, in the most recent figures, up $0.8 billion or 8.3% on May 2021. So this sector is showing remarkable resilience, and that's why the Morrison government is continuing to focus its support on areas inside manufacturing of comparative advantage and strategic importance under our $1.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy. And what we are seeking to do is to apply the skills and the technology of these extremely successful and profitable businesses to problems like emissions reductions that we've been speaking about today, and prioritising sectors that can help in that regard, such as recycling and clean energy and resources technology and critical minerals. And looking at some of the very successful projects in recent grants rounds, Australian Vanadium, a West Australian company, is going to use $3.9 million in funding to fast-track manufacturing of large-scale vanadium redox flow battery systems that can be used to support entire residential power grids as well as off-grid settings such as in mining or agricultural or remote communities. And then we have in the Northern Territory, we've seen Core Lithium. They'll be using a $6 million grant in funding to help build a pilot processing facility for the production of battery-grade lithium hydroxide at Darwin Harbour's Middle Arm Industrial Precinct. So these projects are being supported by the Morrison government, and they will enable that technology to move forward that will drive emissions down. Another fine example is in round 2 of the Modern Manufacturing Fund. Sun Cable will receive $1 million, and Sun Cable is an Australian-founded, world-leading renewable energy company that's developing the world's largest solar farm here in Australia. And this grant will further support Sun Cable's project to establish a solar array manufacturing facility in Darwin. So these are real-life, real-time examples of the types of technologies that can get emissions down, leveraging off these fantastic, successful, profitable manufacturing businesses that have been so resilient during the first phase of COVID.
And I now call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's claim Australians are the winners from the commuter car park program. Does the Prime Minister think commuters who use South Morang, Balaclava or Seaford stations, who were promised car parks before the election, which were cancelled before construction even began, are winners?
The Minister has the call.
Thank the member for her question, and I inform the House, or I remind the House, that our government in fact has committed additional funding to allow the Frankston commuter car park in her electorate to be able to proceed. as we recently discussed when she came to my office to raise this issue and to advocate in relation to the Frankston commuter car park. It's very confusing what Labor's position is. Do they support commuter car parks? It appears they do support a commuter car park in Frankston, and I welcome that. And I welcome the fact that we're committed to deliver it. 500 spots in that commuter car park, multi-storey, and many people on the Frankston line will benefit from that. Of course, we're committed to the MacArthur commuter car park in the seat of the member for MacArthur. Labor's position on commuter car parks is really mystifyingly schizophrenic, because on the one hand they criticise the commuter car park program, on the other hand we certainly don't hear members standing up and saying, oh, the commuter car park that the Morrison government has promised for my electorate, I don't want that because we're opposed to commuter car parks. I'll tell you what our position is. Our position is very consistent. Commuter car parks are delivering benefits to citizens because it reduces congestion on the road network, because it allows people to drive to a railway station to park their car and then get on the train, thereby reducing congestion. Very sensible policy reason for this program. No doubt the very same policy reason which motivated the decision of the opposition to commit to a park and ride fund at the last election. And of course there are 11 commuter car parks committed to by the Morrison government, which are also committed to by the other side of the House. So it is really mystifying trying to discern what Labor's position on this is, but our position is consistent. We're getting on with delivering commuter car parks, and I'm pleased to say that just in the last week or so, the Ferny Grove commuter car park—
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Scullin on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. Relevance. The Minister was asked about 3 projects. He could perhaps mention one of them?
I'd just say to the member for Scullin, if he'd only been asked about that, he'd have a stronger position, but it had a preamble that quoted the Prime Minister. It did open it up, but I'm listening to the Minister.
Mr Speaker, the member for Scullin speaks of relevance. He's desperate for relevance. He thought this was his issue. He thought this was his moment in the sun.
The Minister is now not being relevant to the question.
The fact is, Mr Speaker, we're getting on with delivering commuter car parks, including, just in the last week or two, the Ferny Grove commuter car park, transit-oriented development indeed, in metropolitan Brisbane. We've commenced construction on that.
Member for Moreton.
Joined at the opening ceremony by, of course, the member for Ryan. I congratulate the member for Ryan, the Minister for Defence, and indeed the Queensland Labor Transport Minister. We're pleased to be working with state governments around the country delivering commuter car parks.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Housing, Minister for Homelessness, for Social and Community Housing. Will the Minister please inform the House about the importance of the 2021 census and how it is fundamental to Australia being able to plan for our nation's future?
The Assistant Treasurer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Stirling for his question, a very important question today being Census Day, and indeed for most Australians they will think of tonight as Census Night. I firstly want to encourage all Australians who have not yet been able to complete their survey to get on immediately. You can start it now, but certainly over the course of this evening to complete your census survey. The advertising by the Australian Bureau of Statistics this year was Every Stat Tells a Story, and every single statistic that will be provided by Australians tonight will inform future decisions, not just of the federal government, but state governments, local governments, indeed community organisations throughout the country, and of course business. I want to thank the 3.6 million Australians who have completed a survey that covers nearly 10 million Australians. It means we're about a third of the way through. We'll have the remaining 2/3 of Australians that need to complete their census tonight. We have worked very hard to make the process easier, to make it simpler, Early feedback seems to support that, and we are hoping and working very hard between now and certainly at the end of the evening, but for the remainder of this week, to make it as easy as possible for Australians to get online. The feedback is it takes about 15 or 20 minutes. And so for Australians, again, who are contemplating when they're going to do it, just get on and do it now. It's a quick and easy process. Mr Speaker, every stat truly does tell a story, and the information that is going to be provided by Australians tonight will inform decisions around health expenditure, around education expenditure, certainly around infrastructure decisions. And, Mr Speaker, it will be used by organisations throughout the country, whether it's assisting with mental health, Mr Speaker, so many priorities of the Morrison government. We'll see statistics out mid-next year. And, Mr Speaker, consistent with the government's purpose and what the government has focused on over a long period of time, we have added 2 additional questions for this census. The first is a question asking about long-term health conditions, chronic health conditions, extraordinarily important. But, Mr Speaker, one that will be close to many members on this side of the House, indeed in the whole parliament, will be asking about Defence Force service. We have had an emphasis on supporting our veterans. We want to know as much about them as we can, where they are, how we can support them. So the additional question on Defence Force service, I think, is going to be a great addition. Get on tonight, complete your census. We'll make it as easy as possible.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime
I
Minister.
also seek to make a personal explanation.
Does